Hi everyone, thank you for the lovely intro. I'm Alice, I'm an illustrator from San Francisco. And today I want to talk about a concept called pencil mileage. It's a term that's originated mainly in illustration and animation communities. And it basically describes the process of learning how to draw and getting better at it over time. Now before I became an illustrator, I was a product designer. And in transitioning from designer to illustrator, and by definition, learning how to draw and then drawing professionally, I found this framework of learning to be so useful and one that can be extended to designers, engineers, PMs, writers, etc. So before I start this talk, I'd like to begin with a little food for thought in the form of a video.
Nobody tells people who are beginners, and I really wish somebody had told this to me, is that all of us who do creative work, like, we get into it, and we get into it because we have good taste. But it's like there's a gap, that for the first couple of years that you're making stuff, what you're making isn't so good, okay? It's not that great. It's trying to be good. It has ambition to be good, but it's not quite that good. But your taste, the thing that got you into the game, your taste is still killer. And your taste is good enough that you can tell that what you're making is kind of a disappointment to you. You know what I mean? A lot of people never get past that phase. A lot of people at that point, they quit. And the thing I would just say to you with all my heart is that most everybody I know who does interesting creative work, they went through a phase of years where they had really good taste, they could tell what they were making wasn't as good as they wanted it to be. They knew it felt short. It didn't have this special thing that we wanted it to have. And the thing I would say to you is everybody goes through that. And for you to go through it, if you're going through it right now, if you're just getting out of that phase, you got to know it's totally normal. And the most important possible thing you could do is do a lot of work. Do a huge volume of work. Put yourself on a deadline so that every week or every month you know you're going to finish one story. Because it's only by actually going through a volume of work that you're actually going to catch up and close that gap. And the work you're making will be as good as your ambitions. In my case, I took longer to figure out how to do this than anybody I've ever met. It takes a while. It's going to take you a while. It's normal to take a while, and you just have to fight your way through that, okay?
So whenever I watch this video, I'm always reminded of that sense of excitement and optimism that I feel whenever I start a new project, and it's that feeling that I just want to bottle up forever whenever I'm feeling overwhelmed about the creative process. And what he's talking about here with bridging the gap is really what pencil mileage is all about. It's basically the idea that if you measure the total amount of paint strokes and pencil marks and doodles that an artist makes over time, it would measure to many, many miles worth of paint and pencil. And of course, this isn't like a particularly novel concept or shocking. We're all familiar with the idea of working hard. But what I love about pencil mileage is two things. First, once you're past a certain stage as an artist, the main thing that distinguishes people is not natural talent, but pencil mileage. So it becomes a lot less personal. It's a nod to the idea that, hey, you might be a better cartoonist or still life oil painter than I am or designer, but it's probably not because I just inherently suck as a person, and it's more to do with the fact that I likely have less pencil mileage under my belt. And second, it deliberately takes the long view with juxtaposing mileage with something as small and simple as drawing. What's a tiny mess up or an eraser mark if you've still got many, many miles left to go on your pencil? Your experiments become a lot less precious. So it's a really natural and neutral way to look at the process and psychology of learning, which is something I'm very obsessed with and I'd like to talk about today. And more specifically, I'd like to dive into the journeys of those who have made big lateral leaps in their careers. Leaps that seem improbable, and from third-party perspectives, even impossible or irrational. But there's just something that drives them to do it. And I'd like to start with a little story about drawing. So for a bit of context, I'm an illustrator. I work mainly with tech and editorial clients. This is an illustration I made for Slack. I make illustrations that go onto blogs, magazines, newspapers, on your phones, screens, and user onboarding flows, a little bit of packaging and branding. And this is basically my day. I spend my days drawing and managing the business around drawing. But the truth is that 4 years ago, I did not know how to draw. I could not draw. I wasn't an illustrator. I wasn't even an artistic kid growing up. I went to business school, which is like the spiritual opposite of art. And at the time, I was a product designer who maybe wished I could draw, but when it came to the general arena of illustration, I was a total noob. And as an aside, it's really fun to have these giant squiggly words behind you. If anyone has their phone out, please capture this moment forever, because I think it's still pretty applicable. But back then, if you asked me even like what my possible career options or trajectory could be, I would probably put being an artist somewhere alongside being like a marathon runner or a pop superstar. It was just like an absurd idea and something I thought I could never do. Until one day at my job as a product designer, I realized that I was constantly doodling, sketching, because our team at Dropbox on the design side was so small at the time. Whenever a designer needed illustrations, even if I was a total noob, I would jump at the opportunity to do it with that same excited feeling that I get whenever I watch that video. So even though I was very much a noob, it was something I very much embraced. And I think that whenever we talk about the process of learning and think about learning new things, it's important to kind of bottle up a little bit of that initial excitement and that blind ignorance in a way. Like a little bit of ignorance and naivete is good. Because we give ourselves excuses all the time from moving forward and having vulnerability as beginners. And sometimes it just takes a little bit of that blind confidence to make it happen. We often think of the learning process as looking something like this. Very romantic, very linear. I started here, hit some milestones, and then got to where I wanted to go. But in reality, it looks something more like this, where there's twists and turns. Maybe you can't even see your ultimate destination. Start off in business school, designer, now I draw. It's totally unpredictable. And I think it's totally easy to get a lot of anxiety around the middle part. So it's helpful to have a framework and to remind ourselves of what's part of the normal process of learning so that we don't freak out and give up. So one framework that I like to use when thinking about the psychology of learning is these 4 stages of competence. So basically there are 4 quadrants, and there are 2 variables. On the x-axis, we have consciousness, so you're either unconscious, not aware, or conscious, aware. And on the y-axis, we have competency, so incompetence, noob, or competence, you are passable. So we kind of start off in the upper left with unconscious incompetence. That's when you don't know how much you suck. You're unaware of your relative noobiness. And then we move over to the right to conscious incompetence. Now you are painfully aware of the gap. Moving down to conscious competence. You are competent now, but you really have to kind of work at it. And unconscious competence, which is sort of like what you are trying to do becomes second nature. So just to start off with unconscious incompetence and the joys of being a beginner who doesn't quite know what you're getting yourself into. I started off as an early product designer at Dropbox. I worked on a lot of stuff like this, where on the left, was the original onboarding flow that was like 15 slides, a total mess for new users who had no idea what Dropbox was. And my project was redesigning it, giving it a visual refresh, but also reducing the steps in the onboarding flow from 15 to like 4. And because I was a growth designer at the time, I realized that when it comes to a product like Dropbox that's so complex and it's very confusing for someone who has no idea what Dropbox is to figure out and learn what exactly the service is about, because there is no real-life equivalent to uploading a file on your computer and then it lives in the cloud and then you download it on someone else's computer without sending it to them. It's really complicated for a new user. So I realized that I could either have long paragraphs of text that explain this to users that no one would ever read, or put simple graphics like this that would just nudge at the idea of your files go into this box. And I think this is, it's pretty clear that here I'm at the beginning of my drawing journey. I'm sticking to pretty simple shapes. just a bunch of rectangles, lines, circles. This was for uploading your files to your work Dropbox. So instead of putting something like a briefcase or something office related, I just wrote the words work. And over time, started to level up from level 1 to level 2. So here I've graduated to using more shapes, more colors, people with circle heads. And just over time, as I sort of wheedled my way into becoming an illustrator, this is just something that I ended up doing. Here you can see some of my design wireframes, but these are also my sketches and experiments in learning how to draw. So, at the time, when we're starting out in the journey, we don't see what the absurdities are that we face. Lacking time when you work at a company like Dropbox. They ship at a very fast clip. They're not just going to stop so I can learn how to draw. Technical ability and experience, that's pretty obvious. And lacking a sense of effortlessness. I definitely had to try very hard. But also, there's a lot of good things about being a beginner, and it's easy. We should be optimistic about this stage in the process. I think the biggest advantage that beginners have is speed. When we work on creative stuff, we're often motivated by something internal like passion or enjoyment, or maybe it's just your job and you don't want to be fired. But sometimes things get in the way that overwhelm us and diminish that passion. So it's good to kind of set up a balance, a checks and balances system where maybe if your passion diminishes, but you've still got a lot of momentum behind you, it can push you through the hard stuff. So moving fast, getting out your best ideas, producing a lot, not being precious with each project can help you really go wide. Another thing that is awesome in this beginning stage is finding your friendtors. That's what I call friends who are mentors. I think the concept of mentorship is amazing, and we all probably have people who are in this role for us. But the idea of approaching someone and asking them formally if they want to be my mentor is a little too formal for me. I much prefer to find friends who are maybe 5 to 10 years ahead of me in their careers and asking them to just informally mentor me. And that's why I call them friendtors. And you also have things like story chops, beginner's eyes, and a lot of passion, which I think is mainly just blind confidence. So as time goes on, we transition over from not knowing how bad we are to knowing exactly how bad we are. The good thing is, if you are aware of how much of a noob you are, you've already progressed to step 2 out of 4. So looking on the bright side, you're halfway there. And being aware of your incompetencies, while it's very painful, can also be a really useful skill. For instance, we're talking about the journey of creating personally. But another part of the journey of just having a career is knowing how to present your skills. So if you are aware of what's good and what's not so good, you can present your stuff in a way that highlights the good and hides the not so good. So as an example, these were 2 illustration style concepts that I pitched for Carousel, which was a photo sharing app that Dropbox launched, RIP. But basically, we were trying to figure out what the illustration style for the product would look like. So these are 2 different explorations into that. And you just see here like 2 concepts that I pitched. Really simple, low stakes, not final work. But what you don't see is that behind those 2 were the 3 times as much time and effort that I had to put in because I knew that I wasn't that good. And so, these are just random explorations. There's like weird paint blobs, cartoon stuff. There's like floating hands. But sometimes it's good as beginners to get the practice in so that we can get to the level that we want to be at. Another example, we made these little thumbnails in the illustrations that are like vignettes of people's camping experiences. And I could just tell, like some of these are just not drawn that well. Like the deer's body is really weird. The flowers look really clip arty, not what I was going for. The dog anatomically doesn't make sense. But the good thing is, if you can be critical, it can be overwhelming if you let it be. But if you try to take that and use it constructively, you can learn to present your work in a way that highlights the good stuff. So here, I hid the deer's body, shoved the flowers in the back. The dog is not in the middle. Building a pattern of this sort of repetition of self-editing and having a critical eye eventually leads to high productivity, which leads to improvement, which is guaranteed. It's like surefire. It's one of the most beautiful things about pencil mileage. And it's a really empowering experience to go from barely being able to draw shapes to making an illustrative brand that ends up shipping. So eventually, we then shift over to conscious competency. That's when you are aware that you do possess passable skills, but you really have to work at it, and you really have to keep pushing yourself. And for me, I think it's really awesome to talk about, what we can make with our computers and the creative process, but we would be making a mistake if we didn't discuss some of the heavier stuff behind making creative work. For me, at this point in my drawing process, about a year in, something really weird started to happen, where the combination of working around the clock to not only learn how to draw, and then because I was left with half of the time, doing the job in twice the speed, as well as the mental energy around bridging the gap and not taking a break, meant that something started to build up. It reached a point where I just didn't want to touch a computer. I would have a physical reaction whenever I thought about opening up Illustrator. And it was strange because I've gone through a number of really high pressure academic and work environments before. And this was drawing. Drawing is supposed to be not threatening. Isn't it supposed to be fun? So when I mentioned this to my manager, he was able to sort of immediately diagnose it and say, you have creative burnout. I think you should just take a breather, give yourself some space. And I think that's like the most important thing when it comes to dealing with creative burnout. But the way that we avoid it is creating healthy boundaries for ourselves and definitely working hard, but not pushing ourselves to the point where something that we love to do, like drawing or creating or writing, becomes an activity that we associate with pressure and failure and perfectionism. As for me, one thing that I found was really helpful was talking with some of my friend tours. So I talked to my friend, Allison House, who's a very dear friend and mentor of mine. She was supposed to be at this conference as well. And she gave me really great advice. Life is cyclical. And sometimes when we go through hard stuff, we have two choices. We can either reset and make a big change, or we can try to push through. And for me, it was about pushing through. For me, it was about figuring out what was at the root of this anxiety. And I realized that it was because I felt insecure about not being able to create and stand on my own 2 feet as an individual illustrator. I was sort of tethered to this corporate voice. So after I left my job and started working independently, one of my first clients was an animation studio called Tonko House. They are founded by 2 ex-Pixar painters. So painting and foundational painting is a really big part of their daily routine. Every week they have this setup where they'll just gather a bunch of random household items, set them up, and then everyone gathers around for 2 hours in the morning on Tuesdays and Thursdays, sitting on these like wooden chairs with our computers in front of us on a stool. It's like the most low stakes setup. It's not very ergonomic. And in this low pressure environment, we just start to go back to basics and draw what we see. So, I started off not being that great. This is kind of embarrassing, but, this is a cup with a really weird perspective. But over time, just getting in the habit of doing simple things and simple low stakes repetition can help remind you of why you got into this creative work in the first place. So this was a really simple setup that we had one day. Well, it's actually deceptively simple. So we have a steel kettle and white ceramic mug. These are very reflective surfaces, and we were drawing at 7 a.m. when the sun is rising, so the light is changing in the room and reflecting off of these surfaces. So it's actually quite difficult to capture. But over time, as with more practice, more repetition, it builds confidence, which builds familiarity with yourself and your tools. So it's something that I would challenge each of us to do. If you're an illustrator, take a notepad, sketch what you see around your neighborhood. This is literally my house in San Francisco. If you're a designer, design something small every day or week. Same with engineers or writers. Once you're aware of your competence, you can start to harness this internally and start pushing yourself. So maybe I'll do 5 extra sketches each day. And after a few weeks, I'm a little bit further ahead. And then over time, these small things elevate you to a completely new level. So when you look back and you see how much your work sucked before, actually it means you're on the right track. For me, my risks now come in the form of trying new mediums. The content, the thing I'm doing, which is drawing, is still the same, illustration, but I'm working with chalk, 10-foot painted murals, 800-pixel painted illustrations, and even ice cream trucks. So yeah, I would challenge you to push yourself. If you find yourself going way too hard and getting burnt out, challenge yourself in a low stakes and simple and foundational way can sometimes do the trick. Eventually, along the creative process, we get to a point called unconscious competence. And this is when your competency sort of becomes like second nature. In a way, it's sort of like Zen and transcendence. But I find that time spent at this stage is really short-lived because almost immediately we go back up. We are constantly trying to learn, and it doesn't just end when we reach one milestone. So that's the journey, but what about actually doing the work? I used to have this issue with creative work where I would need to get into the flow. I would say, I'm not in the creative mood, I need to jam it out. But actually waiting around for the creative mood to strike is not efficient and also not reliable. Like imagine telling your clients or your manager, I can't work on this because I'm only creative between the hours of 2 to 4 p.m., call me then. What we should do instead is try to build up that creative discipline like a muscle so that we can turn on the flow in a way that's about repetition and knowing yourself. So this is the schedule and journal of Benjamin Franklin. For those who don't know, he is a really important figure in American history. He was an inventor. He invented the lightning rod and bifocals. He was an author, a politician, also an educator. He was the president of my alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania. And so he was a pretty busy guy, pretty prolific, very productive. Helped us harness electricity. So we look at his schedule, it might look like a really full and busy day, but really it's just a structured partitioning of time. So he's got the morning, which is like life stuff. He's got the noon and afternoon, which is like work, and evening and night, which is life and sleep. And I think that this is so important. If someone like Benjamin Franklin, who is so productive, can set work-life boundaries, then I think surely we should try to adopt some of these things ourselves. Because it sends the message that your life outside of work is not negotiable. We all have important things outside of our jobs. And I especially love his first line here. When he wakes up at 5 a.m., he says, "Rise, wash, and address the powerful goodness," in caps. So the great thing about this is even when you separate life and work, inspirations can come from anywhere. Most importantly, not just the computer. Benjamin Franklin gives himself time for music and diversion and just being a human, which I think not only is good for us as people, but can even impact your work. Just as an example, so these are some of the morning exercises that I sometimes do, going back to basics. I like to draw these abstract shapes in watercolors. It's just very therapeutic, and these are on tiny pieces of paper. And I didn't realize this, but now looking back, one of the first illustrations that I made after I started doing this was this illustration for Slack, which at the time I didn't know this, but now it's totally obvious that this extra practice, this random doodling that I was doing, totally ended up seeping into my professional work. And the shapes, the abstract compositions, the colors are even similar, the watercolor textures. So it's really unexpected where inspiration can strike. As another example, this is my dog Mochi. So one day I was really stressed because I got my first magazine cover job to illustrate the cover. Even though I was stressed, Mochi needed to go for a walk. Mochi is the boss. So we ended up going for a walk, and we found these really beautiful potted plants in the Mission District of San Francisco. So I was instantly like inspired, and I wanted to incorporate this into my work in some way, and Mochi was inspired as well. So when I got back to my house, instead of being stressed, I was full of excitement because I just sketched up this concept for the cover of these two characters watering a city of potted plants, and the plants are kind of growing. And that was the direction that the art director ended up choosing. So I guess all this is just to say, sometimes giving ourselves space to be silly, be human, and not try to be so strategic about our careers can be helpful in helping us produce work that's even better than it was before. And finally, one other thing that I love about Benjamin Franklin's schedule is he asks himself the question, what good have I done today? And I think more than any of the things that I'm talking about today with the creative work, this is probably one of the most important things we should ask ourselves. For instance, I love drawing. It's the thing that makes me happy. But more important is building connections with others and building a community. So that comes in the form of mentoring others, volunteering, working on causes that are important. So, you know, it's great that we're talking about the psychology of learning. And you might be asking yourself at this point, well, like, that's great, but what's the thing? Like, where do I even start? Like, what are my things? And I would say that the theme that the stories of people who have made leaps like this all have in common is this concept of tracing your obsessions. It's the idea that the clues for your next project are often hidden in the oddities and absurdities of our current work. And that's what I think the creative process is all about. There's a quote by Steve Jobs that goes, you can't connect the dots looking forward, but you can looking back. And in a similar way, I think that often it seems absurd that someone would go from business school to illustration or something similar like that, but when you look back, you can really trace the obsessions. And I feel really lucky that we can even get to do this and explore our obsessions. I think it's something that our industry encourages sometimes. So one story that I want to share is that of Allison House. So Allison House is a designer turned 3D artist, and we met when we were both working as product designers at Dropbox. So this is the sort of thing that we were doing. You know, we were UX designers, so making stuff for websites and phones. We were also really restricted to this brand palette. So it's like basically shades of gray and various tones of the Dropbox blue, which, to be fair, is the palette that most tech companies have, various shades of gray and some kind of accent color. And House describes her experience as feeling a little bit constrained by this color palette. And so in reaction to that, she started doing these speed paintings every day. These are like 3 minutes, where she would, you know, paint in this really vibrant palette, opposing the, you know, limited palette of our work at Dropbox. And when you look at her stuff, it has so much motion, so much vibrancy. And then eventually she moved to doing 3D art. So I think when you look at the Dropbox stuff, if you skip directly to this, it looks really random. But when we trace the obsessions backwards, you can totally tell that there are hints of this project in the last project, which was a reaction to the first thing. And over time, she's really built up an incredible artistic voice as a 3D artist, creating beautiful artwork. Another story that I love is that of my friend James Buckhouse. So James went to Brown University, which is in Providence, Rhode Island. And also in Providence is a school called RISD, Rhode Island School of Design. And that's where he studied painting. So he currently works as a designer. He works at Sequoia Capital, and he used to work at Twitter. But what I love about his work is that he totally blends his background and interests as a painter in such a unique way. So this is just like a quick wireframe process of like what a user goes through. And he could have just like listed it out in six lines, but instead he illustrated and painted the process in such a unique way. And the last story that I'd like to share is that of my friend Ash. Ash was a product designer at Twitter and Pinterest, where she worked on stuff like this. That might be familiar to the designers in the room today. And at the same time, however, she had been working on a book for 14 years, which seems like a long time. And she describes the process as working in little snatches of time, sometimes just 20 minutes after dinner. She did this challenge where every day she would try to design a new cover of her book. So this is all like after work, low stakes, which ended up forming the basis of the book that she published. And the work that she did after her day job ended up forming the basis of the book itself. So I think that when we think about our creative journeys, it's really important to think about the obsessions and the little things that we just can't let go of. So I'd like to end today with a little bit of real talk, some questions I would like for you to ask yourself. First, what are your strange obsessions? The doodles that you find yourself drawing? What's that project that keeps you laid up at night? Or what's that thing that you've always wanted to do, but you keep talking yourself out of? And related to that, 5 years from today, what does your day look like? So I mean this in a general sense, like where do you generally want to be? What kind of role or practice do you want to have? But also in a specific sense. So when we think about Benjamin Franklin, what does your actual day look like? Do you wake up? Do you doodle? Do you start painting? Do you start working on your book? The list goes on. And finally, who cares about you? And I don't mean this in a sarcastic way, but genuinely, who really cares about you as an individual and your creative journey? We have friends and family who care, and certainly I think we could say individual colleagues and managers might care about us, but I also think it's a little naive to assume that the companies as an entity that we work at care about us as individuals as opposed to as employees. If there's any person that is guaranteed to care about you, it's you. You are responsible for your own creative journey. So take care of yourself. Don't wait for someone else to choose you. Choose yourself. And as you go on this creative journey, it all starts with putting in that pencil mileage. So enjoy the ride. Thanks.